Breaking news in the Nancy Guthrie case. We now have critical information from one of the nation's leading forensic researchers that fundamentally changes how we understand this investigation. Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic and clinical psychologist specializing in violent crime, has completed a comprehensive statistical analysis of Nancy's disappearance, and what he's discovered narrows the suspect pool dramatically. The numbers are stark and impossible to ignore. Between 76 and 92% of people murdered in the United States knew their killer in some way. That's not speculation. That's documented fact drawn from decades of analyzing thousands of homicide cases across the country. And according to Dr. Brucato's expert assessment, Nancy Guthrie almost certainly knew the person who took her from her Tucson, Arizona home 74 days ago. This revelation represents a major development in understanding what happened that night. We're no longer looking at the possibility of a random predator who happened to choose Nancy's residence. We're looking at someone who had a connection to her, someone who moved through her world in some capacity, someone who knew enough about her to plan what happened. The question investigators are now focused on isn't whether Nancy had prior contact with her abductor. The question is what kind of connection existed and how that relationship can be traced back to identify the person responsible. Dr. Gary Brucato doesn't work with hunches or theories. He's a researcher at Boston College, a member of the expert panel for the Cold Case Foundation, and author of The New Evil: Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. He works alongside Dr. Ann Burgess, the legendary criminal profiler who inspired the Netflix series Mindhunter. When Dr. Brucato analyzes a case, he relies exclusively on data, on peer-reviewed research, on statistical patterns that repeat across countless criminal investigations. His assessment of what happened to Nancy Guthrie is grounded in science, and what that science reveals is both specific and deeply disturbing. If you want to stay updated on the latest developments in Nancy Guthrie's case and understand the forensic methods being used to find answers, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Hex and hit that like button. We're committed to bringing you expert analysis and breaking information as this investigation continues. Let me bring you up to speed on what we know so far, and then explain why this new profile information is so significant. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman living independently in Tucson, vanished from her home 74 days ago. Surveillance footage captured someone moving through her residence with a level of comfort that immediately raised red flags among investigators. This wasn't a panicked burglar grabbing valuables and fleeing. The person on camera spent considerable time inside Nancy's home. They attempted to conceal their identity, but made several amateur mistakes that provided crucial evidence. The individual brought flowers to the scene, presumably as a prop to appear legitimate if anyone saw them approaching the house. They wore a holster incorrectly, in a way that could actually be dangerous to themselves. The firearm they carried didn't match the holster. Despite apparent awareness that surveillance cameras existed, they still got caught on camera at multiple points. These details have been analyzed by experts, and they tell a very specific story about who this person is and what they were trying to accomplish. Here's what makes this new information so critical. Dr. Brucato has applied a rigorous methodology to analyze every aspect of this case, and his findings eliminate several possibilities while pointing directly toward others. His approach begins with what he calls creating motivationally driven buckets. Every crime has a reason behind it, even when that reason seems incomprehensible to rational people. By examining the physical evidence, the victim characteristics, the method of operation, and comparing all of it to thousands of similar cases in the research literature, experts can determine which motivations are statistically likely and which can be ruled out entirely. This process isn't guesswork. It's based on decades of data about how different types of criminals behave, what drives them, what patterns they follow, and what mistakes they make. When you apply this methodology to Nancy's case, several common crime motivations can be eliminated almost immediately. And that elimination process is what narrows the field so dramatically. Sexual motivation is always considered when someone breaks into a home and targets a victim. But Dr. Brucato's analysis reveals this explanation is highly unlikely in Nancy's case. Breaking into residences for sexual assault is already statistically rare. See, targeting elderly victims is profoundly rare. When offenders do break into homes with sexual intent, it involves what's called paraphilic behavior, meaning sexual attraction to a specific inappropriate group that drives them to commit repeated offenses. These crimes create geographic patterns. If a predator were actively targeting elderly women in the Tucson area, we would expect to see multiple similar incidents clustered in that region. No such pattern exists. Additionally, there are specific evidence markers that appear in sexually motivated crimes. Biological fluids are typically present at the scene. There's often staging that reflects the offender's fantasies. Items might be taken as trophies. The crime scene shows signs of the sexual element that drove the attack. None of these indicators have been reported in Nancy's case. No bodily fluids suggesting sexual assault were documented. No fantasy staging typical of these crimes was found. The evidence simply doesn't support sexual motivation as an explanation for what happened. Robbery also fails to explain Nancy's disappearance when you look at the statistics and the actual evidence. Over 1 million financially driven property crimes occur in the United States every single year. Burglary is common. Home invasions happen. But Nancy's case doesn't fit the established patterns for these crimes. Nothing was taken from her home. Think about what that means. Burglars enter homes to steal valuables. They grab jewelry, electronics, cash, anything they can quickly convert to money. They spend as little time as possible inside to minimize their risk of being caught. They absolutely don't abduct the homeowner. And because doing so transforms a property crime into a far more serious offense, with much harsher penalties. The risk-reward calculation for criminals is straightforward. Taking items from an empty home carries relatively light sentences if you're caught. Kidnapping someone carries decades in prison or life sentences. No rational burglar would escalate a simple theft into an abduction unless there was a completely different motivation driving their actions. What about kidnapping for ransom? This is where the statistics become even more telling. Dr. Brucato points out that ransom demands in kidnapping cases follow very predictable timelines. Communications from kidnappers typically occur within 24 to 48 hours of the abduction. In these situations usually resolve within 1 week, because every hour the kidnapper holds a victim increases their risk of being caught exponentially. The longer you keep someone captive, the more opportunities exist for witnesses, for evidence, for mistakes that lead to your identification. 74 days have passed since Nancy disappeared. No confirmed ransom demand has been made public. Even if communications have been sent to the family that law enforcement is keeping confidential, the timeline doesn't match kidnapping for ransom patterns. Additionally, kidnappers treat their victims as what Dr. Brucato calls precious cargo. The victim has value only if they can be returned alive and reasonably healthy. You need to provide proof of life to demonstrate you actually have the person and they're available for exchange. And you ensure they receive necessary medical care and medication because a deceased victim has no bargaining value whatsoever. Nancy was left without her daily medication when she was taken. There are indications she may have been injured during the incident. These facts directly contradict how kidnappers behave when ransom is their goal. Everything about the timeline, the lack of confirmed demands, the treatment of the victim, it all points away from kidnapping for ransom as an explanation. Simple abduction without sexual motivation or ransom demands is extraordinarily rare in the United States. Dr. Brucato's research shows that only about 350 abductions occur annually in the entire country, and the overwhelming majority of those victims are children. Elderly victims are statistically unusual in abduction cases. This rarity forces us to look beyond the obvious explanations and consider what the data actually reveals about crimes against older adults and who commits them. When Dr. Brucato systematically eliminates sexual assault, eliminates robbery, eliminates kidnapping for ransom, what remains is the statistical likelihood that this case involves homicide. Either someone planned from the very beginning to kill Nancy and staged the scene to look like an abduction, or more likely based on the evidence, someone planned to abduct her for financial reasons and everything went catastrophically wrong, forcing them to eliminate her to avoid identification. This is where those numbers I mentioned at the beginning become impossible to ignore. Between 76 and 92% of homicide victims in the United States knew their killer in some capacity. Let me repeat that, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding where this investigation is headed. Between 76 and 92% of people who are murdered knew the person who killed them. That percentage represents one of the most consistent findings in decades of criminal justice research across thousands and thousands of cases. What this means is that in the overwhelming majority of murder cases, the perpetrator is not a stranger who randomly selected a victim. Some prior connection existed between the killer and the person they killed. Now, understanding what knowing someone means in this context is critical, and this is information that's just coming to light through Dr. Brucato's analysis. The connection doesn't have to be close. Nancy wouldn't have to consider this person a friend. She wouldn't even have to remember them as someone significant in her life. The connection could be minimal, casual, even one-sided. We're talking about anyone who had opportunity to observe Nancy, to learn about her living situation, to understand her routines and her vulnerability. A contractor who worked on her property at some point, even years ago. A delivery person who regularly came to her home. Someone who worked at a store she frequented. A neighbor she encountered occasionally. Anyone in the medical field if she received home health care services. The list of potential connections expands when you think about it this way. But it's still a defined list. It's not the entire population of Tucson. Sir, it's a subset of people who moved through Nancy's physical and social space in some capacity. Here's the new information that makes this profile so powerful. The surveillance footage doesn't just show someone in Nancy's home, it shows someone who was comfortable there. Pay attention to this detail because it's significant. The person captured on camera moved through the space without the frantic searching or obvious disorientation that a complete stranger would display. They knew where they were. They had some level of familiarity with the layout. They spent time inside without appearing lost or confused about the geography of the residence. This comfort level strongly suggests someone local, someone who had reason to know not just the Tucson area generally, but possibly this specific neighborhood, or even this specific property. Random criminals passing through a city don't demonstrate this kind of relaxed familiarity. They're tense, they're rushed, they're constantly looking around, trying to orient themselves. The person in Nancy's home showed none of those characteristics. Dr. Brucato points to something in the surveillance footage that's particularly significant from a psychological profiling standpoint. The individual appears remarkably calm. There's no visible nervousness. There are no signs of the physiological stress responses that typically accompany committing serious crimes. Even experienced criminals who have committed offenses before usually show some indication of anxiety when they're actively engaged in criminal activity. The possibility of being caught, the adrenaline surging through their system, the moral weight of what they're doing if they have any conscience at all. These factors typically produce observable stress reactions, sweating, rapid movements, constant checking of surroundings, fidgeting. These are normal human responses to high-stress situations, and committing a serious crime is about as high stress as situations get for most people. The person in Nancy's home displayed none of these reactions. They appeared cool, collected, focused on their objective without visible emotional disturbance. This extreme composure under pressure suggests what forensic psychologists call psychopathic character structure. Now, this is new information from Dr. Brucato's analysis that hasn't been widely discussed before. People with psychopathic personality traits don't experience fear and anxiety the same way neurotypical individuals do. The parts of their brain that process emotional responses, particularly fear responses, function differently. They can commit terrible acts that would overwhelm most people with guilt and horror, without experiencing those emotional reactions. They stay focused on their goals. They don't get distracted by empathy for their victims. They don't panic when things get risky. They compartmentalize in ways that allow them to do horrific things and then return to their normal lives without the visible psychological burden that would destroy most people. Understanding that this person likely has psychopathic traits is a major development because it tells investigators very specific things about who they're looking for. Here's why that matters so much, and this is critical new information. People with psychopathic character structure almost never develop these traits suddenly in adulthood. They have histories. These patterns of behavior extend back to childhood and adolescence, conduct disorder in youth, behavioral problems in school, conflicts with authority figures, cruelty to animals, aggressive reactions to perceived slights. These individuals leave trails of problematic behavior throughout their lives. Someone with this personality structure very likely has had prior contact with law enforcement. They may have arrests for other crimes on their record. They probably have a reputation in their community for being difficult, aggressive, confrontational, or prone to holding grudges over minor issues. People remember encounters with individuals like this because those encounters tend to be distinctly unpleasant and memorable. They're the person who gets into a screaming match at the grocery store over a perceived slight. They're the neighbor everyone avoids because they're always looking for reasons to start conflicts. They're the former employee that coworkers remember as volatile and threatening. This is why Dr. Brucato is now recommending that investigators focus significant resources on interviewing inmates currently in local jails and prisons in the Tucson area. This is a specific investigative strategy based on the psychological profile. Someone matching these characteristics might already be incarcerated for a completely different offense. They might be serving time for assault, for drug crimes, for theft, for any number of things, but people in those facilities, both inmates and staff, might recognize the person captured on surveillance footage. Here's another crucial piece of the profile that's just emerging. Psychopathic individuals are far more reactive to perceived insults and disrespect than they are to actual threats against themselves. Think about what that means behaviorally. Most people, when threatened, will back down to avoid physical harm. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct, but someone with psychopathic traits often cares more about their ego, about not being disrespected, than about their own safety. They get into physical altercations over truly minor issues. Being shortchanged by a few dollars at a cash register. Someone bumping into them accidentally in a crowded space. And a perceived slight in how someone spoke to them. Any situation they interpret as showing them disrespect can trigger disproportionate, violent reactions. These incidents create patterns, they create stories, they create memories in the people who witness them. Former co-workers remember the explosive arguments over nothing. Neighbors remember the threats made over trivial disputes about property lines or noise. Store employees remember being verbally abused or physically threatened over minor transaction issues. Building a timeline of someone with this very specific behavioral pattern could connect them directly to Nancy Guthrie. And this is the new direction the investigation needs to pursue based on Dr. Brucato's analysis. Now, the surveillance footage reveals something else that's important. And this combines with the psychological profile in interesting ways. While the person appears comfortable and unafraid, they also make several amateur mistakes. The holster is worn incorrectly. actually in a potentially dangerous configuration. The firearm doesn't match the holster, suggesting these items were acquired separately without attention to compatibility. They bring flowers as an obvious prop, which is fairly unsophisticated staging. Despite apparent awareness that security cameras exist, they still get caught on camera at multiple points. These errors tell us something specific. This is someone willing to commit violence, someone comfortable enough in this environment to spend time there, but someone who lacks sophistication and professional criminal planning skills. Dr. Brucato uses a compelling metaphor to explain what he believes might be happening here. And this represents a significant theory about the structure of this crime. He describes the person on camera as the waiter, while suggesting that someone behind the scenes might be the chef. Think about what that means. The waiter delivers what the chef has prepared. The waiter follows instructions without necessarily understanding the complete recipe or plan. The waiter is visible to customers, takes the risks of interacting with the public, but isn't the one actually creating what's being served. Meanwhile, the chef remains hidden in the kitchen, orchestrating everything while maintaining distance from direct customer contact. If this theory is correct, and Dr. Brucato believes the evidence supports it, and then the person captured on surveillance footage is not the mastermind behind what happened to Nancy. They're the muscle. They're the person willing to get their hands dirty, willing to take the visible risks in exchange for payment or some other benefit. They're following someone else's plan, which would explain why they make tactical errors. They don't fully understand why certain precautions matter because they didn't develop the overall strategy. The chef in this scenario would be very different from the waiter. More intelligent, more calculating and strategic, capable of planning a complex crime while maintaining complete distance from its execution. This person would live what Dr. Brucato calls a double life. On the surface, they appear normal, functional, maybe even friendly and helpful. They maintain pro-social appearances, and they have jobs, relationships, community connections that seem entirely legitimate. But underneath that carefully maintained exterior, they harbor dark intentions. They might have seemed kind to Nancy. They might have interacted with her in ways that appeared helpful, neighborly, genuinely caring. She might have trusted this person, might have considered them safe, might never have suspected that beneath the friendly surface they were planning something terrible. This is new information about how this crime may have been structured, and it dramatically changes how we think about potential suspects. What would motivate someone to orchestrate the abduction or murder of an 84-year-old woman? Dr. Brucato's analysis points definitively toward financial motivation. When you systematically rule out sexual assault, rule out simple robbery, rule out kidnapping for ransom, what remains at the end of that elimination process is financially driven homicide. Someone stood to gain money from Nancy's disappearance or death. That financial gain could take several forms. Inheritance is the most obvious possibility. Someone who would benefit from Nancy's estate, either directly or by removing her as an obstacle to accessing assets. Access to her property itself could be the motive. Real estate in desirable areas has significant value. Control over bank accounts, investments, insurance policies, these all represent potential financial motivations. Relief from debts or financial obligations to Nancy could drive someone to eliminate her. Resolution of financial disputes where Nancy represented an obstacle to someone accessing money they believed they deserved. And the key insight from Dr. Brucato's analysis is that two scenarios fit the available evidence, and distinguishing between them is crucial for understanding what happened. In the first scenario, someone planned from the very beginning to kill Nancy Guthrie. The abduction staging was deliberate misdirection, designed to make investigators look for kidnappers, for ransom seekers, for criminals with motivations completely different from the true reason. By staging it as an abduction, the perpetrator hoped to direct attention away from people close to Nancy who had financial motives to want her dead. In the second scenario, which Dr. Brucato considers more statistically likely based on patterns in similar cases, someone planned to abduct Nancy for financial reasons, and everything went catastrophically wrong. Maybe they intended to force her to transfer assets, to sign documents, to provide access to accounts. Maybe they planned to hold her somewhere while they ransacked her finances. Whatever the original plan, it fell apart. Nancy may have resisted more than anticipated. She may have fallen and seriously injured herself when they tried to move her. Her health may have failed rapidly due to the extreme stress and fear of being forcibly removed from her home by intruders. An 84-year-old woman, possibly without her hearing aids, possibly without her glasses, disoriented and terrified, being manhandled by strangers in the dark, the probability of something going medically wrong is extremely high. If Nancy fell, if she became unresponsive, if she had a heart attack or stroke brought on by the stress, the entire situation would have escalated in seconds from a planned abduction to an emergency medical crisis. The perpetrators would suddenly be dealing with a dying or dead victim instead of a controlled hostage situation. At that point, the plan is over. The calculation changes completely. They're empty-handed, panicked, and facing a crime far more serious than what they originally intended. When an abduction turns into homicide, perpetrator priorities shift dramatically and immediately. They're no longer executing their careful plan. They're in pure crisis management mode, trying desperately to avoid being caught for murder. This desperation drives urgent decisions about disposing of evidence, and that includes disposing of the victim's body. Dr. Brucato addresses this reality with appropriate sensitivity, acknowledging how difficult it is to discuss, but recognizing the critical importance of being honest about what the statistics and evidence suggest. If Nancy Guthrie is deceased, and Dr. Brucato's analysis indicates this is the most likely outcome, there is unfortunately a very low probability that she will ever be located intact. This is heartbreaking information for the family, but it's based on clear patterns in how offenders behave when they need to eliminate all traces of their crime. In 2025, criminals are acutely aware of the power of forensic science. They know about DNA analysis. They know about dental record identification. They know that any biological material, any remains that can be recovered and analyzed, can be used to identify them and build cases against them. And this awareness drives them to dispose of remains in ways specifically designed to prevent identification and recovery. They leave bodies in remote wilderness areas where animal activity will scatter and destroy remains over time. They use fire to eliminate biological material. They resort to dismemberment to prevent intact recovery. The specific method varies, but the goal is always identical. Make absolutely certain that nothing remains that can be brought to a laboratory and analyzed. Understanding this reality is devastating, but it's necessary to grasp the full scope of challenges investigators face. Without a body, without physical evidence from a disposal site, investigators must build their case through other evidentiary means. This is where forensic DNA analysis becomes absolutely crucial to solving this case, even though the process requires considerable time that frustrates everyone involved. Here's new information about the DNA evidence that hasn't been widely reported. DNA samples were collected at Nancy's home, but these samples are what forensic analysts call mixed or blended. That means biological material from multiple people is present together in the same samples. This isn't unusual in real crime scenes. Homes have DNA from everyone who lives there and everyone who visits. But separating these profiles to identify individual contributors requires extremely meticulous laboratory work. Forensic technicians must analyze the genetic markers present and essentially reverse engineer multiple individual DNA profiles from combined samples. And they're looking at specific locations in the genetic code and trying to determine which markers came from which person. This process cannot be rushed without risking catastrophic errors. Mistakes in DNA analysis can completely destroy the evidentiary value and ruin any chance of successful prosecution. Defense attorneys will tear apart sloppy forensic work. Depending on the complexity of the mixture and the condition of the samples, this analysis could take months, or potentially up to a year, to complete properly. That timeline is agonizing for Nancy's family. It's frustrating for the public following the case. It's difficult for investigators who want to make arrests and bring charges. But there is no shortcut. Doing this right, ensuring the analysis will withstand scrutiny in court, requires time and painstaking attention to detail. Once individual DNA profiles are successfully established, modern investigative techniques offer extraordinarily powerful tools, and this represents hope for solving Nancy's case. Genetic genealogy has completely revolutionized cold case investigations over the past several years. The technique works by uploading DNA profiles to genealogical databases where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. Here's what makes this so powerful. The perpetrator themselves may never have used these ancestry services. They may have been careful never to submit their DNA anywhere, but their relatives almost certainly have. Parents, siblings, cousins, even distant relatives share genetic markers. And by identifying people in the database who share DNA with the person who left biological material at Nancy's home, investigators can build family trees. They work backward and forward through generations, identifying common ancestors, tracing lineages, narrowing down which specific branches of family trees could have produced the person they're looking for. Then they cross-reference with age, gender, geographic location, any other characteristics they know about the perpetrator. This technique has solved numerous cases that remained complete mysteries for decades. The Golden State Killer, who terrorized California throughout the 1970s and 80s, was identified and arrested in 2018 using exactly this methodology. Dr. Brucato believes this combination of genetic genealogy and traditional investigative techniques will ultimately solve Nancy Guthrie's case. It may take longer than anyone wants. It may require patience that feels impossible when a family is grieving and desperate for answers. But the science works. The methodology is proven. As long as the DNA evidence collected from Nancy's home is viable and can be successfully profiled, there is a clear path to identifying who was there that night. Here's additional new information about the structure of this crime. Dr. Brucato strongly suspects that more than one person was involved in what happened to Nancy. The waiter and chef theory suggests a hierarchy, with the visible actor on camera taking direction from someone who remains completely hidden. If this theory is correct, and the evidence appears to support it, then the investigation has significant leverage that hasn't been fully exploited yet. Accomplices in serious crimes very rarely maintain solidarity when they're facing decades in prison or life sentences. The old saying about honor among thieves is completely mythological. It doesn't reflect reality. People turn on each other constantly when the stakes are high enough, when they realize they're looking at spending the rest of their lives behind bars, when they understand that the person they're protecting doesn't actually care about them and will let them take all the blame. This makes one aspect of this case genuinely puzzling, and it's information that needs to be emphasized. The reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery, or to arrests in this case, has climbed past $1 million. Think about that amount. For the vast majority of people, $1 million is life-changing money. It's enough to pay off every debt, buy a home, live comfortably for years, completely transform your financial situation. That reward should be sufficient inducement for someone with information to come forward, especially someone who played a peripheral role in what happened and might rationalize that they weren't directly responsible for the worst outcomes. Maybe they just provided information about Nancy. Maybe they helped with planning but weren't there when things went wrong. Maybe they're feeling guilt about an elderly woman's death that they never intended. Whatever their level of involvement, $1 million should be enough to make them seriously consider cooperating. But yet 74 days have passed without anyone claiming that reward with information that leads to Nancy's recovery or to arrests. This silence demands explanation, and Dr. Brucato's analysis suggests several possibilities. The accomplices might be deceased. If the person orchestrating this operation decided that loose ends needed to be eliminated, they might have killed anyone else who participated. Dead people can't testify. Dead people can't make deals with prosecutors. Dead people can't claim rewards. If this is what happened, investigators should be looking at other unsolved murders or disappearances in the Tucson area around the same time frame. The accomplices might have fled the area entirely. If they understood how serious this became, if they realized they were involved in a murder that's generating national attention, or they might have gotten as far away as possible. Border crossings, travel records, people who suddenly disappeared from their normal lives right around the time Nancy vanished. These all become relevant investigative targets. The accomplices might be absolutely terrified. If they know the person in charge, the chef in Dr. Brucato's metaphor, is capable of murdering an 84-year-old woman, then they understand that person is capable of killing them too. Coming forward, even to claim $1 million reward, even with promises of protective custody, might feel like signing their own death warrant. Fear can be more powerful than financial incentive. Or the accomplices might recognize that coming forward would be too incriminating to themselves. Even with the reward, even with the possibility of negotiating a deal with prosecutors, they might still face serious charges for their participation. If they were present when Nancy died, if they helped dispose of her body, if they were actively involved in planning what happened, they're looking at potential murder charges regardless of cooperation. The calculation of whether cooperating is worthwhile depends on factors outsiders can't see. Based on the psychological profile, Dr. Brucato is now recommending that investigators focus attention on specific populations that might have crucial information. This is new strategic direction for the investigation. Local prisoners and jailed inmates represent one high-priority target group. Someone with the psychological characteristics visible in the surveillance footage likely has a criminal history. These traits don't appear in isolation. They manifest across multiple contexts and situations. This person has probably had contact with law enforcement before. They may have arrests for assault, for domestic violence, for theft, for drug offenses, for any number of crimes. They might currently be incarcerated for something completely unrelated to Nancy's case. But people in those facilities, both other inmates and correctional staff, might recognize the person on camera despite the attempted disguise. Here's why people in incarceration settings might be particularly valuable sources. If there's an element of danger in coming forward, if the perpetrator or the mastermind behind this is someone who inspires genuine fear in the community, inmates might actually feel safer speaking up. They're already confined. They're protected by the physical security of the facility, and they're surrounded by guards and surveillance. They might have less to lose than someone living in the community who fears retaliation against themselves or their family. Dr. Brucato also recommends investigators focus on people existing on the margins of Tucson society. Sex workers, people struggling with addiction, individuals living in what he describes as the no-good patches of the local area. This isn't about stereotyping, it's about understanding criminal behavior patterns. If someone involved in Nancy's disappearance came into money afterward, whether from payment for participating or from accessing Nancy's assets, they likely spent that money in predictable ways. Drugs and alcohol for people with addiction issues. Paying for sexual services. Gambling. Sudden displays of wealth that seem inconsistent with their normal financial situation. People who provide underground economy services, who work in cash businesses, who interact with criminal elements regularly, they notice these things. They notice when regular customers suddenly have money, They notice behavioral changes. They hear conversations. They pick up information. Someone working in those circles might have encountered the perpetrator and possess valuable information without even realizing its significance. They might remember someone bragging about a job. They might recall seeing someone with injuries consistent with a struggle. They might have heard details about disposing of evidence. These fragments of information could be crucial to investigators, but only if people come forward with what they know. Here's another critical element of the profile that hasn't been widely discussed. The physical characteristics visible in the surveillance footage could trigger recognition in ways that have nothing to do with facial features. How someone walks is remarkably distinctive. Even wearing a mask, even attempting to disguise themselves, people move in characteristic ways that are almost impossible to consciously alter. Body language is individual. The length of your stride, how you hold your shoulders, how you shift your weight, the angle of your head, how you swing your arms, all of these create a movement signature as unique as a fingerprint. Someone who knows the perpetrator, even casually, might recognize them based purely on how they move through space. Dr. Brucato makes the point that anyone you know well, you would recognize them walking down the street even if they wore a mask covering their entire face. That recognition isn't based on seeing their features. It's based on hundreds of subtle cues about posture and movement. This is why releasing the surveillance footage to the public is so important. Someone watching that video might have a moment of recognition. The way that person turns their head, how they reach for something, the particular way they stand. These movements might trigger a memory. That's the guy who used to work construction in my neighborhood. That's the person I see at the gas station every morning. That's my former coworker. That's someone I know from somewhere, and I need to call this in. Now, there's a question that's crucial to understanding this case, and it's something Dr. Brucato addresses directly. If this crime was financially motivated, if someone was after Nancy's money or assets, why choose her specifically? Nancy Guthrie's daughter is a public figure. This case has generated enormous media attention, national news coverage, daily updates across multiple platforms, a reward exceeding $1 million. Constant public pressure on law enforcement to solve this. For criminals supposedly motivated by money, selecting a victim absolutely guaranteed to generate this level of scrutiny seems counterintuitive at best and genuinely foolish at worst. Tucson has many wealthy elderly residents who live alone and would be vulnerable targets. Why choose the one whose disappearance would create a media firestorm? This question is important because the answer tells us something specific about the perpetrator's relationship to Nancy. When criminals take unnecessary risks during the commission of an offense, when they do things that aren't pragmatically required to achieve their stated goals, it typically indicates one of two things. Either they're acting on fantasy or grudge that overrides rational risk assessment, or they have a personal connection to the victim that dictated the choice, regardless of the increased danger. A purely pragmatic criminal, looking strictly for financial gain, would target vulnerable victims who wouldn't generate massive investigations. They would prioritize people whose disappearances might not even be immediately noticed, who don't have family members with resources and platforms to keep the case in the public eye. Nancy Guthrie is the complete opposite of that ideal target from a criminal perspective. Her family would notice her absence instantly. Her daughter has both the resources and the public platform to ensure this case receives sustained attention. Law enforcement would automatically prioritize the abduction of an elderly victim. Everything about selecting Nancy as a target dramatically increases the perpetrator's risk of being caught. Yet someone chose her anyway. Someone decided that despite all these risk factors, despite knowing this would generate enormous attention, Nancy was the target. This choice points directly to a personal element in the crime. The perpetrator or perpetrators didn't select Nancy from a database of wealthy elderly people in Arizona. They didn't pick her randomly. They selected her specifically because they had some connection to her. because they knew her in some capacity, and that connection provided knowledge about her living situation. It gave them information about her vulnerability and her routines. It possibly provided details about her finances and assets. From a victimological perspective, analyzing characteristics that made her vulnerable, Nancy was indeed an easy target. She lived alone. At 84 years old, she couldn't physically resist an intruder. Her age made her vulnerable in ways that younger potential victims would not be. But vulnerability alone doesn't explain why she was chosen. Tucson has thousands of vulnerable elderly residents. The person or people responsible chose Nancy Guthrie specifically because they knew Nancy Guthrie. This is the critical insight from Dr. Brucato's statistical analysis. We're not looking for someone who randomly selected an elderly victim, but we're looking for someone who had a reason, whether professional, social, financial, or personal, to know who Nancy was and where she lived. Dr. Brucato emphasizes that whoever committed this crime wasn't especially intelligent. The surveillance footage reveals someone willing to commit violence, someone comfortable enough in the environment to spend time there, but someone who fundamentally lacks sophistication and professional criminal planning skills. They made mistakes that experienced criminals would never make. These errors tell investigators something important about who they're looking for. This person didn't think through everything that could go wrong when you enter the home of a frightened 84-year-old woman in the middle of the night. She might not have her hearing aids in, so she can't hear instructions or warnings. She might not have her glasses, so she can't see clearly. She would be absolutely terrified if awakened by strangers. She's fragile in ways that create enormous medical risk. The capacity for the situation to escalate into catastrophic medical emergency was huge, and the evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. Blood was visible in some of the surveillance footage from Nancy's home. That blood could indicate intentional violence, but it could just as easily result from an accidental fall as she was being removed from her residence. Think about what that scenario looks like. An elderly person being forcibly moved by people she didn't expect to see. In darkness, possibly without her hearing aids or glasses, disoriented, terrified, not understanding what's happening. A fall under those circumstances would be almost inevitable. If Nancy fell and seriously injured herself, if she became unresponsive, if her health deteriorated rapidly due to the combination of physical trauma and extreme stress, the entire plan would collapse immediately. The perpetrator would suddenly be dealing with a medical crisis instead of a controlled abduction. They would be empty-handed, panicking, and facing a situation far more serious and far more criminal than they initially anticipated. Dr. Brucato's strong professional opinion is that events unfolded exactly this way. The abduction didn't go according to plan. Something went wrong early in the process. The person on camera ended up with nothing to show for the enormous risk they took. At that point, priorities shift entirely. You're no longer focused on executing your plan. You're in desperate damage control mode. Eliminate every trace of evidence. Dispose of anything that could possibly connect you to the scene. Contact whoever orchestrated this operation and admit complete failure. Try to figure out how to avoid spending the rest of your life in prison for a murder you may not have even intended to commit. The calculation changes completely when an abduction for financial gain transforms into a homicide. The stakes escalate beyond anything the participants likely imagined when they first agreed to be involved. What might have seemed like a relatively controlled crime with manageable risk suddenly becomes murder, and murder investigations receive completely different levels of resources and attention than property crimes. Here's new information about communications allegedly from the perpetrators. The investigation has reportedly received multiple ransom notes or messages claiming to be from Nancy's abductors, but law enforcement has not confirmed which, if any, are genuine. This creates significant uncertainty in analyzing the case. Hoax communications are extremely common in high-profile investigations. Opportunistic people seeking attention send false ransom demands. Cruel individuals who derive satisfaction from causing pain to grieving families manufacture fake evidence and false leads. Distinguishing genuine communications from fraudulent ones requires careful analysis of details that law enforcement typically doesn't share publicly for strategic reasons. If they release specific information about the real communications, hoaxers can mimic those details in future messages, making it even harder to separate real from fake. Or if any of the ransom notes are genuine, they add another dimension to the psychological profile. A perpetrator who sends ransom notes without having a living victim to exchange demonstrates specific personality characteristics. They're needling the family. They're deriving some satisfaction from the attention, from being in the public eye, from having a kind of notoriety. This behavior is consistent with certain psychopathic, narcissistic personality types. These individuals don't just want money. They want recognition. They want to feel powerful and important. The crime itself becomes a performance with the public as their audience. They're compulsively following media coverage. They're reading every article. They're watching every news segment. They want to know what people are saying about them, what theories investigators are pursuing, how close anyone is getting to identifying them. But this raises a question that Dr. Brucato identifies as crucial. If the motivation appears financial on the surface, why add the sadistic element of ransom notes that can't possibly result in payment? Why take the additional risk of communicating with the family when you have nothing to exchange and no way to complete a transaction? One possible explanation is that the financial motive is actually a cover, a misdirection for something more personal. The real reason for targeting Nancy might be what Dr. Brucato calls elimination. She might have been in the way of something, an impediment to someone's goals or plans. Maybe she controlled assets someone else wanted. Maybe she knew information someone needed to keep secret. Maybe she was a witness to something that could destroy someone's life if revealed. Maybe she represented an obstacle to a relationship or situation someone desperately wanted. The staged abduction would throw investigators off the scent, making them look outward for financial criminals instead of inward toward people close to Nancy with personal grudges or needs. Dr. Brucato has written extensively about elimination murder, and this represents an important framework for understanding certain types of homicide. Elimination murder occurs when someone kills a person they know because that person represents an obstacle to something they want. The obstacle might be financial, like an elderly relative whose assets someone wants to inherit or control. The obstacle might be related to burden, like a dependent whose care has become overwhelming. And the obstacle might be informational, like a witness to another crime or someone who discovered fraud or embezzlement. The defining characteristic of elimination murder is the elaborate effort made to make it appear that a total stranger committed the crime for no clear reason. The person staging the scene desperately wants investigators to look outward, toward random predators or opportunistic criminals, rather than inward toward people close to the victim who had personal motives. The problem with elimination murder staging is that people who commit these crimes typically aren't sophisticated enough to create truly convincing scenarios. They don't understand what evidence different types of crimes actually produce. They don't fake robbery convincingly because they don't take the right items or they leave obvious valuables behind. So they don't fake sexual assault properly because they don't understand the biological evidence those crimes create. The staging reveals itself through inconsistencies. Nothing was taken from Nancy's home. If this were a genuine robbery, valuables would be missing. The absence of theft is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that financial gain through stealing property was never the actual objective. If the goal was ransom, the 74-day timeline without successful exchange demonstrates that plan failed spectacularly or never genuinely existed. What remains when you eliminate those possibilities is that someone wanted Nancy eliminated and created an elaborate false narrative to conceal their involvement and misdirect the investigation. The statistics supporting this theory are compelling. 92% of homicide victims knew their killer. Once Nancy's disappearance is classified as a likely homicide, whether intentional from the beginning or the result of an abduction gone wrong, that percentage becomes the foundation of the entire investigation. The probability is simply too high to ignore. Someone in Nancy's life, someone she encountered in some capacity, someone who moved through her world even tangentially, is responsible for what happened. The investigation must focus on identifying who had the intersection of motive, means, and opportunity. Who had reason to want Nancy gone? Who had the capability to plan and execute this? Who had access and knowledge about her home and routines? Dr. Brucato's analysis provides a roadmap for investigators. Instead of pursuing every possible theory, they can focus on the most statistically likely scenarios. They can prioritize suspects who match the behavioral and psychological profile. They can concentrate resources on DNA analysis and genetic genealogy rather than chasing leads that don't fit the evidence pattern. This targeted approach increases efficiency and the likelihood of successful resolution. Nancy Guthrie deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. The Tucson community deserves to know that the person or people responsible will be held accountable. Every day that passes without resolution is another day stolen from all of them. But the investigation continues behind the scenes. Evidence is being processed in laboratories. Leads are being followed methodically. And experts are applying decades of knowledge and research to understanding what happened and identifying who's responsible. The 92% statistic shapes everything. 9 times out of 10, Nancy knew the person who took her. That person saw her not as a stranger, but as someone familiar. They had interacted with her, spoken with her, perhaps smiled at her while concealing their true intentions. They moved through her life in some capacity, all while planning or preparing to end it. This betrayal makes the crime even more disturbing than a random attack by a stranger. For continued breaking coverage of developments in Nancy Guthrie's case and expert analysis of the forensic science being used to find answers, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Hex. We'll continue bringing you updates as this investigation progresses. Thank you for demanding justice for an 84-year-old woman who deserved to live her final years in peace and safety.